Joe Rogan's life and professional direction puts him in contact with a wide range of personalities. And though the controversies he attracts are usually ones that surround the subjects he discussed on his podcast over the years, Rogan has also managed to find himself in some pretty sticky situations, both online, on national television, and of course during UFC broadcasts. These are 10 times Joe Rogan lost control on live TV. Number 10. Fear Factor. To kick things off, we first bring you one of the most memorable Joe Rogan on-screen moments. Though he doesn't appear on regular broadcast TV at all these days, a lot of people would have had their first exposure to Rogan through his job hosting the popular NBC show Fear Factor. At the time, Joe was still plying his trade as an MMA commentator and had already found success during a stint on the popular sitcom News Radio. But the major success of Fear Factor during its heyday saw him reach a new audience altogether. As you would expect, the contestants on the show were some pretty unique characters. One might even say that they were often as volatile as some of the fighters Rogan was used to dealing with. And on one episode of Fear Factor, a confrontation between two contestants saw Joe forced to intervene and eventually subdue his aggressor using a Thai plum clinch.
Hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? You can't assault people.
Please. Oh my God.
And then all of a sudden they start going at it, and I was like, all right, I gotta break this up because Joe's gonna kill him.
Given Rogan's long history as a martial artist, he was able to defuse the situation and nobody was hurt. Looking back on it now, Joe himself doesn't speak too fondly of his time on Fear Factor, calling it something he did purely for the advancement of his career and the nice paycheck. Number 9. Handling an aggressor. Over the years, though he is known for his comedy, his commentary work, and his background as a fighter, Rogan's sharp debating skills have been one of the strongest tools in his arsenal as he engages in long and drawn-out conversations with guests on his podcast. Whenever there's a need for him to get a little assertive, Joe's ability to do so has seen come up on top in a lot of potentially messy situations. However, one viral video from a few years ago saw him confronted extremely aggressively by a fellow comic who had a real issue with the various stances he has taken over the years. To Rogan's credit, he does a decent job at retaining the upper hand. But as his adversary continues to berate him, eventually putting a hand on his face in a very patronizing manner, Joe lets her know that there are boundaries by pushing her off of him.
Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
All in all, it was pretty clear that she had come to aggravate him. And considering just how persistent and abusive she was, it's pretty commendable that he didn't escalate any further. Keeping a cool head is paramount when attempting to keep yourself out of any potentially disastrous situations. And when it comes to maintaining composure, few do it better than the show business veteran. Number 8. As awkward as it gets. If there's one cardinal sin that Rogan has repeatedly committed on live television, it's his insistence on interviewing fighters who have just been knocked out, despite their precarious mental state. As a commentator and an employee of the UFC, doing right by the fighter is key, both in terms of helping each competitor's own personal brand, but it also ensures that the sport doesn't look bad. Sure, Joe is definitely improving in this regard, after a few rocky moments with big-named athletes that forced his hand. But over the years, some of the most awkward moments inside the cage have come from poorly advised post-fight interviews. Chief among these was his infamous interview with Gray Maynard after he had just knocked himself out with a slam on his opponent, Joe Emerson. The visible, dazed Maynard refused to acknowledge that he went out, something that ruled the fight as a draw. Rogan, being Rogan, tried to dominate the narrative by one-upping the still confused Maynard on live television.
Look at the replay, bro. Bro, look at the replay. You picked him up, watch the dump, bang. You hit your head down, now watch this. You're out. Watch this.
He's done right there.
He is done, but so are you. You're unconscious. Look at you roll over. You're completely unconscious.
Seriously, this was just a nasty way to have your night spoiled. Indeed, the draw wasn't ideal, but getting owned by a commentator who should have just let you say your piece made the whole experience that bit more unfortunate. Number 7. Sticking to the narrative. Few fighters are as beloved by the masses as the golden era veteran and former UFC light heavyweight champion Quinton Rampage Jackson. During his heyday, he was brash, outspoken, and totally fearsome inside the cage. However, one constant issue he had during his time with the UFC came from his belief that Joe Rogan and the commentary team were biased against him, always falling into the same narratives when describing the action in his fights. The key talking point were always his cardio and his wrestling. And according to Jackson himself, they seemingly had their mind made up about him before the fights ever began. And in fairness to him, Rogan is known for his tendency to lose himself in his own narrative, falling away from the truth of what is happening in the cage and instead relying on his preconceived notions. In the end, the pair made up, but even still, Joe's habit of doing this has been a major presence in his commentary over the years.
And I always want you to know that if I say anything, it's never out of disrespect. I like you and I root for you, and I've always thought you're a cool guy. Ever since we hung out together when we did that Inside UFC thing, we hung out all day. I like you, dude. I root for you. If I ever say anything about your game, it's only because I want you to do better.
Number 6. Ice Bucket. Moments inside the UFC octagon that have nothing to do with fighting don't get any more infamous than the Ice Bucket incident. Any MMA fan worth his salt will know exactly what you're talking about as soon as this hilarious event is brought up. Ronnie Torres was taking a break between rounds during his battle against Melvin Gillard when his cornerman, UFC champs Jose Aldo and Renan Barão, stumbling into the cage and knocked over their fighter's ice bucket, covering their athlete's corner in ice. If that wasn't bizarre enough, Rogan immediately started verbally abusing both of them, shouting at them to clean it up and calling them back when they attempted to leave prematurely.
Being
still
spilled
ice.
inside the octagon.
It's still too much. Get back in there. You're not done. There's ice all over the floor. What are these guys do? They ran out. I'm done. We got it. There's 100 pieces of ice still on the floor.
Whether he was aware of the fact that he was shouting at 2 UFC belt holders or not is unclear, but after telling Mike Goldberg that someone should kick their asses, we're guessing he didn't have a clue. Remember, if you're enjoying our content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Number 5. A bad move? Once again, another awkward post-fight interview that really should have never happened. The event was UFC 214, and Joe's fellow co-commentator Daniel Cormier had just lost in brutal fashion to his major rival Jon Jones, in a defeat that looked like it had brought their competitive relationship to an unfortunate end. Rogan, who wasn't about to let a moment like this go undocumented, decided to interview his friend, despite the viciousness of the TKO he had just sustained. DC, to his credit, did his best to give his thought, but he couldn't help but sob his way through an entire conversation. And though as time went on, eventually the public would come around to this modern-day fan favorite. In the days that followed, Cormier was the subject of several nasty memes and general ridicule. Rogan publicly apologized and vowed to never interview potentially concussed fighters again, although he hasn't always stuck to this promise.
You saw the UFC this weekend. Did you see where I f***ed up and I interviewed Daniel Cormier after he had been knocked out?
Yeah.
Dude, here's something that's like people think that somehow or another the UFC told me not to do that and I did it. Nobody said anything. It was just 100% my up. And it was also my idea in the first place to stop interviewing fighters after they've been knocked out.
Number 4. A heated argument. Ask anyone who devotes themselves to the martial arts, and they will likely tell you about how their pursuit of their chosen discipline has given them at least some level of inner peace. And a large part of this stems from the fact that your confidence in public situations grows exponentially. And though there is usually no danger of any serious altercations, the fact that you know you're fully well and adequately prepared for one is certainly a major boost. And for Joe Rogan, though he's indeed gotten into fights in the past, one memorable instance that involved one incredibly foolish man opposite him was quickly dealt with as Joe dipped into his wide knowledge of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to subdue him. The lesson? When Joe Rogan tells you he's going to choke you out if you touch him again, you'd best walk away.
Oh, exactly. Touch me again, and I'm going to choke you out on camera.
What's on now?
You got your gun? You got your gun?
I'm gonna get a belt from this.
Number 3. Questions over Jose Aldo. UFC 194 was an event that saw Joe come under quite a bit of criticism after he made some comments about the featherweight champion Jose Aldo when he believed himself to be speaking privately. During the fighter walkouts, when Rogan's mic should have been muted, the veteran commentator can faintly be heard questioning whether Aldo's body looked different, implying the past use of steroids that were no longer a factor due to USADA. Of course, he thought he was saying this off the record, and was understandably quite surprised to find out that his private thoughts had been made very, very public. He later apologized for his statement and tried to brush it off as a mere chit-chat, but all in all, this definitely managed to anger a lot of Jose Aldo fans. And if you want to talk about having a bad night, the fact that the legendary Brazilian got knocked out in just 13 seconds shortly after? Yeah, that was a pretty terrible sequence. Whether it was a screw-up in the production room or something that could have been avoided, this thankfully has never happened again on a UFC broadcast. Something that has no doubt saved these commentators from further blushes. Number 2. Biased commentary. If there's one key criticism that has followed Joe Rogan's commentary over the years, it's his ever-present tendency to completely ignore what's happening in the cage and fall into his own narrative, losing control of what he's telling the audience at home. And though fighters rarely call him out on it, the fans of the former lightweight champ Khabib Nurmagomedov took issue with his calling of the Eagles' lightweight title-winning performance against Al Iaquinta. A fight that was largely one-sided, Khabib won the bout on all 5 scorecards in what was a short-notice matchup. However, during the fight itself, he couldn't help but shower praise on Iaquinta during the most inconsequential of moments. He later apologized publicly and stated that he had more or less got caught up in the action, giving props were due to Khabib as champion. Number 1. Mark Coleman incident. And finally, we come to an incident that is shrouded in quite a bit of mystery, even today. Now, both Joe Rogan and Mark Coleman have written off this little altercation as nothing more than a friendly scuffle. It does look as though this brief scuffle got a little too heavy for its own good. Whether it was just some awkward posturing or something a bit deeper, the former UFC heavyweight champion Mark Coleman got a little too aggressive with Rogan as the pair met in a random corridor after a comedy show. What started as some playful grappling got strangely aggravated as both men continued to engage. Seriously, it was a pretty weird moment, and though it ended with Rogan and Coleman embracing, fans weren't totally convinced. Coleman himself said that when wrestlers give each other hugs, it often turns into something else. Instincts kicked in, and the rest, as they say, is history. And that will just about do it for this video. Again, if you enjoyed today's video and want to see more, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thanks for watching.